welcome back to the Near Memo with Mike. What was your name? What's your name again? I almost said David, Mike, and Greg. Mike and Greg today, and the Near Memo is generously brought to you by the Transparency Company. Ask for transparency.com. This is episode 199. We're on the cusp of historic episode 200, which I think David will be here for, to talk about the recent EU preliminary finding that Google and Apple were in breach of the DMA, which we are going to be talking about briefly in a minute. In addition, we're going to be talking part 4, 5, 6 of the verification suspension problem that has vexed many people. And we're also going to be discussing a kind of grab bag of issues surrounding AI and competition and who's behind, who's ahead, what are the dynamics in the market now. So let's just, Mike, do you want me to do it or do you want to do it, the EU recap?
It's all yours. I have only read it superficially.
Well, so basically the European Commission, which is the investigatory regulatory body of the EU that manages competition issues, issued a ruling, a preliminary finding, which is the culmination of a lot of investigation and hearings. And you and David were in Europe for some of that last year around hotels, travels, and shopping, and I'm forgetting the third category.
Airlines, I think.
Yeah, airlines. That's right. So it's kind of hospitality, travel, and shopping. And Google has
specifically in hospitality, it's hotels. They have not yet touched.
Yes, they have not touched restaurants. That's correct. And what they found basically was that on a preliminary basis, Google and Apple, but we're only talking about Google today because Apple's issues are different, were in violation. Google was in violation of the DMA, Digital Markets Act, by self-preferencing, treating its own services, shopping, hotel booking, in a more favorable way than it treats rivals. Now, Google, of course, has famously taken steps to change the look of the SERP, introduced different features like the places sites. It's not a carousel, places sites, and other elements to try and address the EU's concerns. They said those were insufficient to remedy the problem. And so this is a kind of a significant finding that Google has violated the DMA. What is next, apparently, is that Google gets a chance to respond in writing to look at the documentation and respond and essentially argue its case. Google, in a post yesterday, today is the first day of spring, by the way, happy spring. In a post yesterday, Google sort of defended itself and was a little bit defiant, saying, what the EU is trying to do is hurting consumers and businesses in a variety of ways, blah, blah, blah. Security, bad user experience, all of this. So it appears that they will try and contest this. It's very unlikely that they're going to persuade many people. And so it seems like they're headed towards some sort of fine. We'll see, because this is just a preliminary finding. But
yeah, there's a couple of interesting things in that. One is, obviously Vance went over a couple of weeks ago and told Europe that they shouldn't impinge on U.S. tech companies. There's that. We don't know where Google and the U.S. government stand because the DOJ recently, continued under Trump the attempts to break Google up, or at least get them to sell Chrome.
Yeah. I think those are two different things.
They are two different things, but the question is, what is the relationship between our government and Google and the EU, right? I mean, if our government comes in and says, you got to go easy, we know you got to do this, but give them a small fine, they might just give them a small fine. Well, and Google might just move on and not worry about it.
Well, that's a real question. I mean, you did see Luther Lowe, who's now Y Combinator, formerly of Yelp, their statement encouraging the White House to embrace the DMA for competitive reasons. I think, the attitude, the relationship now between Europe and the US is hostile. And I think Trump and co are trying to pressure the Europeans. And so this may get involved in more tariff activity or some other form of pressure. But I think you raise a very real point. There was an initial fine. I don't remember who it was for. I'm blanking on that. That was pretty modest. So this is the real question. How strongly is Google going to be penalized if it doesn't make changes that bring it into compliance? And that's where the Europe's cojones, as they say in Espanol, come into question. If these fines are just token fines or cost of doing business kind of fines, which is historically what they've been, then,
The DMA has huge potential fines.
right,
Question
for
is,
successive violations. If they fail to remedy this, I mean, this sets up a very interesting situation because Google can say, we don't agree, we'll make this token concession. Then the EU comes back and says that's not enough. Um, you know, pay more. What happens? It's a kind of a game of chicken in a certain way.
and in all of this, even though Google has been strongly self-preferencing in local, which is a series of verticals,
which
really.
is
They've
which is not officially part of this investigation.
in fact, it was excluded by Google's language and actions. They made it seem like local was a standard part of regular search. It's just built into regular search. It's entity search, just like hotels, just like airplanes.
Right, identical.
And yet they made an effort to, and did some interesting sort of passive aggressive stuff, doubled down on the local packs, put at the same time as the initial DMA changes were going, they put and subsequently still have multiple local packs in the results. So maybe they will compromise by pulling one of the local packs out, which they stuck in. But local's still been excluded from all this. So local is one of Google's huge competitive advantages. I think
It's
even more so than hotels in Europe, more
yeah,
so than
yeah.
as we saw in hotels, booking is very strong in Europe and Google is not as strong. And airlines, I think there are alternative choices. But local, I think Google is unique in their positioning, and it's understandable that they're defending it, but it hasn't been looked at yet, really, by the DMA.
Yeah, I think that the new. I'm trying to find the quote. David wrote a piece on some initial thoughts that's on our site under the Google and DMA section. I think the signal coming from the European Commission is that they want to just expand this. They want to expand the rationale of the DMA to encompass basically everything, including local, rather than doing what they called, I think, a whack-a-mole process where do look at one thing, it's still going on somewhere else. But it's very interesting because it's we'll see what happens with the DC circuit in the US around the sale of Chrome. Of course, I would predict that the court is going to largely agree to the DOJ's position and mandate the sale of Chrome. We'll see if that happens. But Google, of course, will appeal this to the Supreme Court, which will tie it up for several years, during which time nothing will happen. So
at which point we'll be on to AI search, and that's a story for another segment. But
yeah. I mean, the irony of this is the same thing that happened to Microsoft in a way. So Microsoft was held to be a monopoly, and the judge in that case said we got to break up Microsoft into three parts. This was in 1999, 2000. The George W. Bush came along and settled with Microsoft with some sort of token concessions, and nothing happened to Microsoft. But at the same time, Google sort of came along and kind of wiped out Microsoft from a certain point of view, even though Microsoft's a more valuable company today. But market dynamics are ultimately better than regulatory solutions if they're allowed to exist unhindered by monopolistic behavior, which we clearly have in this case. So we will talk more about this issue with David's sort of insight, because he's in Europe right now next week, and that should be an interesting conversation. But let's move on to the suspension verification algorithm issue that you've been tracking, Mike.
right. So for the past two of these, we've been reporting on a dramatic increase in suspensions, and it turned out there was simultaneously an increase in re-verifications, which I believe are related. Last night, Google actually made a public announcement, which is quite rare in this regard, and they limited it in an interesting way. They said that there was an issue causing a spike in re-verifications for some accounts last week, but we've been talking to managers of bulk accounts, and they've been reporting re-verifications issues escalating since February, which matches very closely the escalations I'm seeing in suspension cases. Yext actually stopped moving updated data to Google about a week ago, and they published this on their website, where they noted that they saw increased re-verification counts across Google listings. So it obviously happened before the 13th for EX to have implemented this. It had to be happening a lot. Clearly, the story isn't being totally told, as is Google's way. The fact that they announced it publicly means that a lot of their big accounts are being affected by this. And so they had to say something. My current theory is, after having looked at it for 3 weeks, and at the beginning of this week, the suspension reports were still escalating in the forum. So on Monday, we still saw a big uptick. Interestingly, the reports over the last 3 months have come in on Mondays, which means maybe they're implementing this algorithmic change over the weekends. My theory and hypothesis is that there's some sort of new trust algo. There's something in the profiles that Google is now checking for. If you change your listing for any reason, that check gets put into place, gets triggered. We don't know quite what Google is looking for yet, but we've got some theories. This started in January and increased in February and through the first part of March. And it manifests differently depending on whether it's a trusted account or a trusted location. So in the case of a trusted account, Google with Bulk and a lot of their API customers develops a trust in the account, and they can do more things in their account. For example, in Bulk, you theoretically can add new locations without each location being verified. So in that situation where they trust the account, but maybe whatever's in the listing triggered this new algorithmic see, they make a small change. In that case, it gets unverified. Now, it's very difficult for a Bulk account to manually verify 10 or 15 locations. Incredibly difficult. Whereas in the case of the single home service business, it just gets suspended because they don't trust the account or the listing, and whatever change they made triggered this. So we think it's the two sides of the same coin, that Google is looking for some compliance issue. They turned the algorithm loose. We started seeing the uptick. They finally responded last night after what I believe to be a month and a half of this. The response is unusual, indicates that
Things are pretty bad.
things are pretty bad. And this is something that we talked about with Brad Weatherall quite a bit, that it takes a lot for them to admit that things are bad. It takes a lot for them to make a public statement. But clearly, as we've seen the backlog in support cases go, historically, suspensions when things are running correctly take 5 days to get an appeal done, literally 3, 4, 5 weeks at this point to get appeals done. So this has rippled through their system and rippled through their biggest clients, forcing re-verification. So it's an ongoing story. Our recommendation is the same as was last week.
Do nothing.
Do nothing. Don't make any changes to your account. Don't give Google any reason for their algorithm to look at your listing, because again, we still don't know what's causing it. And until such time as the support gets down to a week or 10 days where you can get an appeal done in a reasonable period of time, you don't want to risk your listing being out of commission for a month. So do no harm, do nothing.
And you've got an article on this for our all access subscribers to Near Media that's under the analysis section. You'll put it in the show notes for this podcast.
Right. And I'm going to update the article today with Google's statement, which came out after the article was published.
Okay. It's interesting. I'm just struck by the degree to which it doesn't seem like, and I drew this inference from Brad Weatherall's comments too, that Google doesn't really understand its own algorithms. It doesn't really, it doesn't really understand. This was a comment about, I think Ben Gomes was the source of this when he was sort of running search or second in command in search, that I may be misattributing it to him.
I think it came out in one of the trials where he was worried about AI because
too much reliance on machines, or the black
box. It's going to obfuscate the actual causes.
Yeah, so they would lose their understanding of how the algorithm worked. I have no insight into this, really. I'm just reacting to the comments, and that would be problematic for them. And this may be these verification issues and other things that we've talked about may be the fruit of that change. It's as a sort of momentary digression. 3, 4, 5 years ago, there was this discussion about how everybody should teach their kids to code. This is going to be the most valuable skill of the future, right? So the CEO, well, I mean, shows you how fast things change. The
Yeah,
CEO of
well, 9 or 12 months ago, people said, "Oh, you should become a prompt engineer."
right.
Right? Same thing.
This is going to become the norm. That the code will be generated by AI. People will lose their sense of what's in there and how to do it. And we'll see. We'll see what the upshot of all that is. But that's not a
Well, it took 6 years for the coding advice to become irrelevant. It only took 6 months for
for
the
the
prompt
prompt
engineer
engineering.
advice to become irrelevant. The speed of irrelevancy is increasing, I've
Yeah,
observed.
yeah. That could be Blumenthal's law.
Yes, you are becoming irrelevant more quickly.
Yes. All right. So let's
As Greg and I struggle for relevance.
and coherence. So there's a kind of a kitchen sink discussion now about kind of competition and AI and some of the things going on. There's a whole bunch of things obviously going on. There was a Brittany Muller post on LinkedIn talking about her observations about AI mode, which I've done some work on as well. Darren Shaw Whitespark commented on that post. This looks like the beginning of the end for ChatGPT. And it's an interesting question as to whether AI mode, the combination of AI overviews and AI mode, will be enough, Google enough for people such that they don't go to ChatGPT to have the AI experience. I mean, the thing that people really like versus search, traditional search, is they like the conversational interaction. They like the ability to ask follow-up questions. They like the direct answers and the context that you get in an AI response versus search.
And the confidence with which it answers.
Well, yes, presumably,
I,
but they're not entirely clued into the hallucination issues, but they like the user experience is the bottom line. They like it a lot. And this is what Google is responding to with AI overviews and AI mode now. It is trying to replicate the ChatGPT experience within a Google environment to keep people on Google, keep people clicking, and keep the ad revenue flowing.
and we've seen this trend in the app version of Gemini on the iPhone. We spoke about this several weeks ago, where they started integrating Google Maps into Gemini and search into Gemini, and Gemini 2.0 became quite competent comparatively to ChatGPT. Still not as good, but much more competent than Gemini 1.0 or 1.5 or whatever. And so Google is evolving apparently fast enough. The question is, as ChatGPT is moving forward, Google's moving forward, Bing seems to be mired in irrelevancy.
Yeah, Bing is definitely irrelevant.
Apple and Amazon are TBD. If it's just a fight between ChatGPT and Google has the surfaces. They have search and they have the phone
Workspace and Gmail and
and
Android.
Gmail. They
This is
and
this is
YouTube. And we're going to see
right.
Gemini and YouTube here.
Everywhere,
So
everywhere that Google touches is going to have Gemini behind the scenes or at the margins. And this was what the DOJ was very concerned about in its filings with the court in the antitrust case, is that Google would, leverage, to use the overused word, its dominance across all these different areas.
surfaces,
Yeah,
software, hardware. Yeah.
right. Search in particular, but not exclusively, to create a dominant position in AI, to dominate the AI market before it's had a chance to develop organically on its own. Now, you could argue that's not true because ChatGPT owns the brand and there's a lot of usage and it's growing of
Netscape
ChatGPT.
owned a brand too.
Right, that's right. And I think there is a very real possibility. I don't agree with Darren's comment that it's the beginning of the end, but I think there's a very real possibility that AI mode and AI overviews will be enough for a good chunk of the audience in informational search context, which is where a lot of this is happening right now, to keep them on Google, to keep them within Google and preserve, retain that user, which has become Google's primary objective, dual objectives: keep people on Google, use, within the Google environment, as opposed to going off to third-party websites only when they have to, and retain and grow ad revenue.
And how does ChatGPT continue to grow? Do they grow strictly as a standalone brand with an app on your phone and an app, web access on the desktop? Is that enough? I mean, they've been burning, I think, $5 a
Well, that's the
year.
question, right? I mean, what is enough? ChatGPT doesn't have to decimate Google or take Google's market. They need to make the economics of their business work, and that may be highly difficult for them, and it may force them to start monetizing with advertising. I suspect that's in the pipeline, because subscriptions alone, or dramatically increase the subscription prices. If they do that, they're going to lose people. They'll lose some number of people. I mean, where ChatGPT really shines is in these, ChatGPT Plus and Pro. The free version of ChatGPT gives you, rations your access, doesn't give you all the features. I mean, some of those have been moving down market from the paid version to the free version. And Google and Gemini is making most of the stuff that it does free. So that puts pressure on ChatGPT. But they have to make the economics of the business work, and we'll see how that happens. I don't think it's the beginning of the end for them, but I think it's probably in many mundane, if you're just looking for the ability to ask follow-up questions about hotels in New York City, AI mode is going to be good enough for you, as opposed to needing to go to, Perplexity or Claude or ChatGPT or Grok or, Grok. I mean, I despise Elon Musk, but Grok is actually very good.
No, you don't despise a guy who's had 14 kids and 14 businesses and is the world's richest guy. How can you despise
Yes,
such an interesting character?
Yes. In 50 years' time, we can take that attitude. But Grok is actually very, very
he's
good.
Single-handedly saving white humanity. What
Yes,
do you mean?
that's true.
14
it's a very important mission. So another quick comment that's related is I was having trouble with ChatGPT last night, so I switched over to Grok and I was using Claude. And these are not all interchangeable. They're not all one-to-one substitutes for one another, but they kind of are. There's a commodity quality. I mean, I don't want to go too far in that direction, but there's like, okay, if ChatGPT can't do it, then I'm going to go over to this one. If Claude isn't going to do it, I'm going to go over to this one. And so I think that's a fundamental problem. I mean, this is what Google used to say about switching. It's just a click away. And people never did that. People never switched. They didn't go to Bing. They didn't, use Yahoo. They used Google. But now, because the behavior is not as entrenched. I mean, again, ChatGPT is the leader, but the behavior is not entrenched to the point where you wouldn't just switch over to another one, ask your same question or prompt, and just use that one.
And it'll be interesting to see, for example, when Amazon
Alexa Plus
rolls out, and I don't know how many of their current devices it'll work on, but it'll be interesting to see if that, for example, hits ChatGPT or Google. It'll be interesting if Apple gets their act together with Siri, how that impacts it, right? I mean, those are hardware platforms that have usage at the moment,
right?
And where these interactions are more natural, right? I mean, I interact with Siri currently 10 to 20 to 30 times a day. Everything from adding things to my shopping list to turning on the lights to taking notes, whatever it is, looking up recipes, interacting with my activity monitor. I use it 10 to 50 times a day, and that's even without sophisticated AI. I can imagine if they ever get it, whether they're tightly...
But you would use it more and for more things.
It seems that way, right? And that is the disadvantage that ChatGPT has, is they don't have a hardware platform like Google, like Apple, or even like Echo, which is a sort of an also ran from a hardware platform point of view. But
it's got they have a lot of, they have at least several 100 million installed base in terms of these devices.
Yeah, but how many of them are? Not all of them are going to run.
Well, it only works
Alexa Plus.
Right. It only works on the sort of higher end sort of display devices. I think now there's only a few of them. Eventually, Amazon said it would. They're using that as a buying incentive. Like, hey, if you buy one of these newer, more expensive devices, you get access to it. But they're supposed to roll it out to more devices. I don't know if it'll get to 100%. Probably not. But I mean, this goes to the question of distribution, which is partly what the DMA is trying to get at. is using structural advantages in the market as a way to sort of create a dominant position. But I mean, Amazon we don't know yet, seems to have addressed its Alexa problem. I mean, previously the conversation was Siri and Alexa are built on these sort of older, more brittle frameworks, and they don't, they can't accommodate AI. They have to be re-architected. And Amazon seems to have done that with Alexa Plus.
Claims to have done, both integrated the more structured approach of the previous one with the new open-ended
Right,
approach.
which is a version of what Google is doing with its RAG and structured, data.
Well, what they claim to be doing with their
graphs.
Gemini replacement of the assistant also, and which Apple advertised they were doing, but hasn't been able to demonstrate.
Hasn't done. Right.
Right. So it's still, I mean, all of these chips are falling. The question is which ones will ultimately be useful and which ones will consumer adopt. It's still 2 years out or a year out.
Well, I can tell you, for the main computer I use, I have a HomePod that I listen to music on, and I don't ask Siri questions. It's completely annoying because whenever I address Siri in that environment, my office, I've got the HomePod and I've got the phone, and the HomePod trumps the phone, and so it screws up the responses. But anyway, that's a different conversation. But I have an Echo there, and that's the thing that I use for all kinds of stuff. I just ask quick math questions, definitional questions, all kinds of things. And so that would be the device I would use probably, as opposed to Gemini. But that's just me.
And TBD. I mean, that's my point. Is that all of this is TBD?
Yeah, and it's
TBD to whether or not generative AI is ultimately useful day in, day out, all the time. Like, I use Siri quite a bit. I get answers to, random queries. The other day I asked it, what is the flash point of avocado oil and what is the flash point of peanut oil? I couldn't ask it compare. I tried to ask it compare the two, couldn't do it, but I could get it individually.
Yeah.
I mean, those kinds of questions.
I think AI is incredibly useful. I don't think it works for everything. And I think right,
the market, and it also doesn't work for everything in each mode. In other words, voice is one mode for AI and output is another. For what I do, and I use ChatGPT every week with our podcast, I need text output, and which now Riverside does. It gives us a transcript.
You can get that from voice mode. You get text output.
You can, but it isn't as efficient as uploading the transcript and telling it.
Yeah, for sure, for your specific use case. An interesting,
right. And my point is that there are a million use cases. Which ones will gravitate to voice? Right, which ones will stay in a more traditional way of it?
The sort of, I'm calling it the zero-sum discussion that's going on about, is ChatGPT or some other AI tool going to replace Google? That to me is just flatly on its face not true. It's not. What and
it's also that you can make the same argument about speech and typing, that we will have incremental speech interactions that won't replace the typing interactions. The question is, what will those be and where will they be and how will they?
Right, and that's the bigger pie theory, that this is all just additive to search and there's no real substitution. And I reject that also. I think there are clearly cases where people, and I in particular, I'll just generalize from my own behavior, I'm using Google way less. I still use Google. I use Google for specific things. If I want information, if I want, but there's a bunch of use cases. I'm typically using an AI, and then I might go to Google to navigate to something, or to, as part of a transaction, which I can't do on ChatGPT. And so I think,
well, what we learned about, though, extrapolating from our own personal experiences in our research, was our use cases were not the average use case. Yes. In our user research, we see users doing all sorts of amazingly different things that we didn't anticipate. It was our user research so reinvigorated my view of local search and the variety of behaviors. And I'm sure it's the same here, that we think people act like us. We think they look like us.
Well, and this is the mistake a lot of digital marketers make, and they don't understand their audience. They don't know. They make assumptions about consumer behavior or their audience behavior based on sort of anecdotal information of the people around them or their own experience, which may not be accurate.
To avoid that trap, we need to end this podcast.
Well, I suppose. I was gonna talk about one more thing, just real
Okay,
quickly.
go ahead.
One
You have
real
my
quickly
permission.
as a kind of
You don't need my permission, but you have.
coda. Thank you. So people right now are scrambling to figure out how do I appear in AI and what's the difference between local SEO best practices and AI, and it's mentions not links and blah 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 and all that. And it's important for people in local to remember that local is in a better position in many ways than just sort of generic publishers. AI mode and AI overviews are going to decimate clicks in certain contexts. Many fewer clicks will happen going forward in certain kinds of contexts. But for local, it's a different story because what people are ultimately doing is making a contact or making an offline transaction of some sort. And so it's really about getting to the business and then the conversion, as opposed to who's going to win the click for some e-commerce transaction or something like that.
Yes, and agentic software, as we saw with my test of this feature where Google calls all the tire replacement places, agents may affect that and may insert itself in that process.
Yes,
Right
for
now,
sure.
I agree with you 100%. Local, you're going to get either you get the call from Google or you get the call from someplace at GBT, or you get the driving directions. Local, it's about the conversions. It's not going to be as heavily impacted. Your website traffic may be, and it may make you think you don't need a website because it's seeing less traffic and less conversions. But to me, you need to be feeding these machines more data, not less, and structured data and good, clear content silos with good, clear
Yeah.
lists of the things you
and
do.
and this is the
But
Rand this is the
you know,
Rand Fishkin point about, don't focus on traffic, focus on, conversions. And
conversions, right?
which is,
Exactly, and
I
that's
think
always
good
been the
advice.
argument in local.
And
Focus on conversions.
we'll save the agent conversation, the impact of agents on local and transactions, for another day. But you're absolutely right. But that's a little farther out. But it is a real thing, and there's some profound implications for the web as a whole, content and websites and apps as a whole. If you look out 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, it may be a radically different experience. On that note, I want to thank again the Transparency Company for helping support this podcast. If you're interested in sponsoring, let us know. You know where to find us. And thanks again to you, Mike, as always. Subscribe to our newsletter and, keep the conversation going.